Hey everyone, in this guide I'll show you how I painted this Space Wolf Terminator using a makeup sponge, also known as a beauty blender. Yep, the same kind used for makeup. I'm keeping the process straightforward and aiming for speed and coverage over precision and tiny details. The goal here is to quickly get your model to a high quality, tabletop ready standard. Once you've got this solid foundation down, you can easily add more details if you want. The makeup sponge is actually pretty great for this method. It's super cheap. You can buy heaps of these sponges in bulk for just a few cents each. Plus they're versatile. I even use separate ones to clean up enamel or oil washes. Speed-wise, it's almost as quick as an airbrush, and it gives the model a nice, subtle textured look. Perfect for a Grimdark Space Wolf. Alright, let's jump straight in. First up, I'm going to quickly dampen the sponge. Just dip it into some clean water, squeeze most of it out, leaving it slightly damp. Doing this will thin the paint just enough, so I won't have to add extra water later on. I'm starting off with AK Afro Shadow. This will create some nice shadows, and it'll contrast well with the Space Wolf bluish grey I'll be using later. Now I'll apply this brown over the entire model. The sponge holds a lot of paint, so you may need to remove some on a paper towel, just to make sure it's not overloaded and going on too thick. I find that with a damp sponge and the consistency of AK paint, I get really good coverage, smooth and even, just from the sponge being a little damp. If the paint feels too runny, that usually means there's too much moisture in the sponge. In that case, I just use a paper towel to absorb even more water before picking up the paint again. This is actually one of the downsides of using the sponge. It's definitely not the best for base coating. As you can see here, the sponge doesn't really get into every recess and crevice. What I usually do at this point is grab a larger brush and just quickly go over the areas the sponge missed, filling in those deeper spots. Next up, I've got anthracite grey. I've rinsed out the sponge in clean water, making sure there's no leftover brown in there, and now I'll apply this grey all over the model. I'll leave some of that darker brown still visible, especially in the deeper recesses. And again, where the sponge struggles, I'll switch back to my larger brush to get a more solid grey layer. For the next few steps, I'll start gradually mixing Fenrisian grey into the anthracite grey. I'll add it bit by bit, slowly building up layers over the base coat. I'm applying these layers similarly to a zenithal highlight, focusing more towards the top, basically where the light would naturally hit the model. With each new layer, I'll add a touch more Fenrisian grey, ease up on the pressure slightly, and narrow my focus. This way I get a nice smooth transition. This final layer will be Fenrisian grey. I'm applying this really lightly, just to the highest areas that would naturally catch the most light. Before that, I remove a lot of the paint and moisture from my sponge using a paper towel. The more paint I take off, the more control I have over where it goes. Now, I'm going to give the model a super quick dry brush using Fenrisian grey. I'm not going too strong here, I just want to catch the edges on the highest points of the model. This isn't meant to fully highlight everything, it's really just to subtly mark out those edges. I'll be doing proper edge highlights later on, so this step is just to help guide that. Now moving on to the shoulder pad. For the yellow shoulder, I'll start building up from pink. I'll gradually mix white into the pink and apply it in layers using the sponge, continuing until I end up with a white zenithal highlight over the pink. Then I'll finish off by adding a layer of Imperial Fist contrast paint over the top. The reason for doing this is pretty simple. A pink base with a white zenithal highlight and a transparent yellow painted over the top results in a yellow finish with really nice orange gradients. It's okay if some pink gets onto other parts of the armor. I'll tidy that up later. Now that I've got a solid pink to white zenithal, I apply a layer of Imperial Fist contrast over the top. I used this straight out of the pot, didn't thin it down, just spread it evenly over the entire shoulder pad. One coat was all it needed. For some areas that'll be bone coloured, like the crux terminatus and parts of the shield, I'll base coat an afro shadow first, then I'll sponge on some tan earth, gradually mixing in buff, building it up until I'm happy with the bone look. I'll also base coat any leather areas in afro shadow. Now for the weapon, I just base coated it with dark silver using a brush, because I wasn't keen on contaminating my sponge with metallic pigments. To give this Terminator a gritty Grimdark look, I'll apply an all-over enamel wash using AK Wargame Dark Wash mixed with White Spirit to help the wash flow better. This wash settles nicely into all the recesses, creating depth and giving that weathered, battle-worn look. I'll let it dry for about half an hour. One reason I really like enamel and oil washes is they're super forgiving. After applying it, I can reactivate it easily with a bit of White Spirit even if it's dry. To clean up the excess wash, I'll grab a different sponge, add some White Spirit to it, and remove the excess wash, keeping it mainly in those recessed areas. Just make sure to swap sponges if you do this. You don't want to use the same sponge you painted with for this step, you're going to have a bad time. Now the wash is completely dry, so I'm going back in with another quick dry brush highlight using Fenrisian Grey again. I'm lightly dry brushing the raised edges of the armor, not really hitting the flat panels, just gently picking out those edges. For the axe, I've switched to a lighter metallic. I'm using trash metal here. I'll dry brush a quick highlight onto the blade, mainly catching the top area where the light naturally hits, leaving it darker towards the bottom. Now for the eyes, my method's pretty straightforward. First I'll base coat them with deep blue, even letting a bit of that blue overspill around the lens. Then I'll grab some pure white, add a small line right in the intersection of each eye, and finish by glazing over that white with a thin blue ink. The transparent ink will tint the white into a nice bright blue, while leaving the surrounding areas a darker blue, giving it a subtle OSL effect. For all the bone sections, I'll quickly edge highlight with buff, just to sharpen up those details. And at this stage, you could definitely stop here, this model is tabletop ready to go. But I'm not done just yet, there's still a few things I want to add to bring it up a notch. Okay, so it's been a couple of days since the last recording, so apologies if the lighting looks a little different. The only change I've made off camera was painting the top part of the helmet black. Now I decided to add some freehand patterns onto the armor using Tenebrous Grey, just to add a bit of variety and spice. I also painted a few other areas, like the leather loincloth using a dark colour, just to help break things up a bit more. Highlight using a lighter grey. I believe this was ash grey, nothing too intense, just enough to subtly sharpen up those edges. At this stage, I felt the model needed a bit more tone variation in the shadows, just something different to break things up. So I decided I'd try using a liquid pigment. I've never actually used one for shading before, but that's exactly what experimenting is all about. I've got this enamel liquid pigment here called Old Rust from AK, and I'm grabbing a synthetic brush, the one I normally use for oils, and I'll roughly paint this into areas where I want to add a bit of tonal variation. I'm mainly placing it in lower sections where there'd naturally be deeper shadows, or just areas where I want to add a bit more visual interest. There's really no right or wrong way to do this, it's all personal preference. Just like with enamel washes, this liquid pigment can be reactivated and feathered out using white spirit. After placing down the pigment, I'll clean my brush in white spirit. With that damp, clean brush, I'll reactivate the pigment at the edges, carefully pushing and blending it into the rest of the armor, creating a smoother transition from the reddish tone into the bluish grey. Like any other pigment, this stuff dries pretty matte and dusty, which I think gives a really cool effect. So now, I've got some nice contrast between different textures. The pigment areas are matte and dusty, while the armor itself is a bit glossier. If you're not a fan of this difference though, you can always use a matte varnish at the end to tie everything together. And there you have it, a solid and fast way to paint your Space Wolves with a Grimdark style using a sponge. But like I said earlier, this whole thing was just an experiment. There are definitely things I'd change next time, and I wouldn't exactly call this the most optimized method ever, but it's definitely a fun way to paint. Thanks so much for watching. If you've got any questions, let me know down below, and if you like this kind of content and want to see more, please like and subscribe. Cheers.